The night had been meant to be simple. Just a few friends, some food, and a quiet evening in. Eric had invited Jason and Mark over after weeks of promising to catch up. I liked both of them in different ways. Jason had the kind of energy that filled a room. Quick-witted, always smiling, always ready with a joke. Mark was the opposite. Reserved, the kind of man who watched more than he spoke, but when his eyes met yours, it felt like he was reading something you hadn't said out loud. We ordered takeout and sat around the living room, plates balanced on our laps. The soft hum of music played in the background. Jason was telling some ridiculous story about a college trip, and Eric was laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes. Mark just smirked quietly, sipping his drink, but every so often, his gaze would flick toward me. It wasn't the kind of look you could ignore. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but to me, it felt deliberate. Long enough to notice, short enough to deny. I found myself glancing back once or twice, unsure if it was curiosity or something heavier pressing between us. As the night stretched on, the conversation slowed. The warmth from the wine and the comfort of the couch began to make everyone lazy. Eric's laughter turned to yawns, and before long, he was leaning back, his eyelids heavy. "You okay there?" I teased, nudging him gently. "Yeah," he mumbled, already halfway to sleep. "Just so tired. Long week." He stood up, stretched, and excused himself to the bedroom. "You guys carry on," he said over his shoulder. "I'll probably crash." And just like that, I was alone in the living room with Jason and Mark. Jason immediately leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your husband can't hang anymore," he joked, shaking his head. "Used to be the last one awake every time." I laughed softly. "He's been working a lot lately." Jason's grin lingered, but then his eyes moved over me in a way that made the air feel warmer. "Guess it's just us now." Mark shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said much all night, but the silence around him didn't feel awkward. Felt charged. I got up to clear the empty plates, more to break the tension than anything else. "I'll just put these in the kitchen." "I'll help," Jason offered, springing up quickly. I waved him off. "It's fine, really." Still, he followed me in, leaning against the counter as I rinsed the dishes. He told me another story, this one softer, more personal, about a bad day at work. His voice was low, his eyes holding mine longer than before. There was something in the way he spoke, like each word was meant to keep me there, rooted in that space between us. Mark appeared in the doorway then, leaning one shoulder against the frame. He didn't interrupt, just stood there watching. The kind of watching that wasn't casual. I tried to ignore the sudden rush in my chest. "Do you guys want coffee or something?" I asked. Jason shook his head. "Nah, I'm good." "Same," Mark murmured, though his eyes never left mine. We returned to the living room, and the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was in the pauses, in the way Jason's knee brushed mine when he sat down again, in the way Mark's gaze seemed to trace the space between us. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination making the quiet feel heavier than it really was. But then Jason leaned back, tilting his head to look at me. "You know," he said, "Eric's lucky. You've got this way about you." The words landed differently than a casual compliment. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Mark's eyes flicked briefly to Jason, then back to me, as if he were silently agreeing. "Don't listen to him," I said lightly, trying to keep it playful. Jason smiled, but there was something in it, something knowing. Mark just kept watching, his expression calm but intent. The minutes felt longer than they should have. The sound of Eric's faint breathing from the bedroom was the only reminder that the rest of the house still existed. And yet, here in the living room, it felt like the world had shrunk to the three of us. I caught myself wondering why I hadn't just excused myself and gone to bed too. Why I was still sitting here, my heart quietly thudding, as if I were waiting for something I couldn't name. Jason leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You ever feel like some nights have a different kind of energy?" I looked at him, then at Mark, and the way Mark was watching me made it impossible to say no. That was when I realized it wasn't just in my head. Something was unfolding in the quiet, and I was standing right at the edge of it. Jason's question lingered in the air, unanswered. I felt it settle between us like a shared secret neither of us wanted to explain out loud. Mark shifted slightly in his seat, leaning forward just enough for me to notice. He wasn't smiling, wasn't teasing, just watching with that steady, unblinking gaze. Jason's energy felt like a spark, playful and bright, but Mark's attention was heavier, like heat that seeps into you without warning. The clock ticked softly from the wall. Somewhere down the hallway, Eric's steady breathing filtered through the quiet. I told myself to stand up, to excuse myself politely, but instead I stayed exactly where I was. Jason leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine. "You seem tense," he murmured, his tone halfway between concern and mischief. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though the warmth creeping up my neck betrayed me. Mark tilted his head slightly, his voice low. "You don't look fine." I gave a nervous laugh, hoping it would diffuse whatever was happening. "You two are impossible." Jason grinned. "That's what makes us fun." He sat back for a moment, stretching his arms behind the couch, but his eyes never left me. Mark, on the other hand, shifted just enough so that when Jason leaned away, he was suddenly closer. I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, something subtle but unmistakable. "Jason talks too much," Mark said quietly, his lips curving into the smallest of smiles. "I'm more about noticing things." There was a weight to his words that made my pulse skip. Before I could think of a reply, Jason was back, leaning in from the other side, so that I was caught between them without moving an inch. It was a strange sensation. Jason's light-hearted presence on one side, Mark's intense stillness on the other. I glanced toward the hallway where Eric slept, the door still closed, and felt the air grow heavier. Jason's hand brushed mine. Not a full touch, just the back of his fingers grazing my skin. I didn't pull away. Mark noticed. His eyes flicked to where Jason's hand had been, and something unspoken passed between them. It was quick, almost too subtle to catch, but it made my stomach twist in anticipation. Jason stood then, muttering something about getting another drink, and walked toward the kitchen. For a moment the quiet deepened. Mark took that opening. He moved just slightly closer, his knee now touching mine. The contact was light, but it sent a current through me that I couldn't ignore. "You know," he said softly, "he's not the only one who's noticed you." I swallowed, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark." Before I could finish, Jason returned, his presence filling the space again. He handed me a glass of water with a small smile, but there was something in his eyes, something sharper than before. He sat down again, but this time, instead of reclaiming his original spot, he settled in where Mark had been, leaning in, his voice dropping lower. "Miss me?" I laughed nervously, trying to keep it casual. "You were gone for like 30 seconds. Jason's grin widened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he reached for the blanket draped over the back of the couch and pulled it across my lap. The gesture was simple, even kind, but his fingers lingered just a little too long. Over Jason's shoulder I caught sight of Mark, now standing by the kitchen doorway, his eyes locked on us. There was no hostility in his expression, but there was an unmistakable challenge there. And then, without a word, they switched. Jason stood, moving toward the kitchen as though he'd forgotten something, and Mark took his place beside me. The exchange was smooth, almost practiced, and it sent a rush of adrenaline through me. Mark didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, his presence heavy and calm, as if waiting for me to acknowledge what had happened. I finally met his gaze. "You too?" I trailed off, unsure how to finish. Mark's voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "Sometimes it's not about talking. Sometimes it's about being in the right place, at the right time." Jason returned again, settling into the chair across from us this time, watching. His expression was unreadable, but I could feel his attention like a hand on my skin. It was impossible to ignore now. They were moving around me like a game of unspoken signals, each taking turns being close, each testing the invisible line I hadn't stepped over, but hadn't moved away from either. My heart pounded as I realized I hadn't said no. Not once. The clock ticked on, Eric's breathing unchanged in the distance, and I found myself wondering just how far they were willing to take this, and how far I was willing to let it go. The quiet in the room had taken on a strange kind of weight. Jason leaned back in the chair across from us, one arm draped casually over the side, but his eyes were locked on me. Mark sat close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, his knee still brushing mine as though it belonged there. Down the hallway, Eric's breathing was slow and steady, the sound of a man lost in deep sleep. That sound should have made me feel safe. But instead, it made me more aware of how far I'd already let things drift. Jason's voice broke the silence. "It's late." The words were simple, but the tone carried more than just an observation. It was a signal. Mark shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're right. Maybe we should head out soon." The words were ordinary. The look wasn't. Jason stood and moved toward the couch again, his steps slow, deliberate. Without needing to speak, Mark moved away, giving up his seat as Jason sat down beside me once more. It was the same switch as before, smooth, unhurried, as if it had always been part of the plan. I felt trapped between the urge to stand up and the pull to stay exactly where I was. My fingers tightened slightly around the blanket Jason had left over my lap earlier. "You're quiet," Jason said, leaning just close enough for his voice to feel private. "Thinking about something." I forced a small smile. "Maybe." Mark had moved toward the door now, collecting his jacket, but even from across the room, his attention was fixed on us. There was no jealousy in it, only that same silent awareness that had been there all night. Jason glanced back at him, and again, that unspoken communication passed between them. It was fast, but I caught it. A look, a shift in posture, a small nod. Mark stepped forward again, placing his jacket over his arm. "Ready?" he asked Jason, though his eyes never left me. Jason hesitated. "Yeah, almost." It was Jason who stood first this time, brushing past Mark on his way to the hallway. I wasn't sure if he was going to the bathroom or just giving Mark the space to close out the night in his own way. But either way, it was another deliberate change in position. Mark returned to the couch. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just sat there, his knee finding mine again like it was inevitable. Then he spoke, his voice low. "You didn't stop us." Froze. He didn't smile, didn't tease. He just stated it like a fact. Before I could form a reply, Jason's footsteps came back down the hall. Mark stood smoothly, stepping away just as Jason entered the room again. That was the last switch of the night, quiet and clean, leaving nothing visible for anyone to question, but everything for me to remember. Jason looked at me for a long second before speaking. "We'll head out. It's late." I stood too, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't dare admit. "Thanks for coming over," I said, my voice sounding too normal for what I felt. Mark opened the door, stepping into the cool, early morning air. Jason followed, but before leaving he turned back to me. "See you soon, Lena." It was a harmless enough goodbye. But in the way he said it, slow, certain, there was a promise. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, the silence of the house rushing in around me. Down the hall, Eric shifted in bed but didn't wake. The faint sound of his breathing returned, steady and peaceful. I walked into the bedroom and found him exactly as I'd left him hours earlier, one arm thrown across the pillow. I stood there for a moment just watching, and the contrast between the man sleeping here and the two who just walked out the door was almost dizzying. Slipping quietly into bed, I lay there in the dark, my mind replaying the night in fragments. The glances, the near touches, the way they'd moved around me like some unspoken game. And the part that unsettled me most wasn't what they'd done. It was that I hadn't stopped it. Days later, when Eric mentioned inviting Jason and Mark over again, my stomach flipped. He said it casually, without a hint of suspicion, and I nodded as if nothing had happened. But the truth was, I already knew exactly what I would think about when I saw them again. And I already knew I wasn't sure I would resist. Because some nights leave a mark you can't erase. And this one, this night of quiet switches, of unspoken invitations, was going to stay with me for a very long time.